Hi, listeners. Just a reminder that all parties mentioned in this episode are innocent until proven guilty. Any opinions given belong to the hosts of Hoosier Case File. Any ads heard during this episode that are not in our voice are placed by third-party agencies. They should not be considered the opinion of or to be endorsed by Hoosier Case File. Welcome to Hoosier Case File, a podcast that delves into Indiana true crime cases. I'm Mary Quigley.
And I'm Rebecca Wilhelm.
We will be your guides into the tales that have baffled law enforcement and left communities in suspense.
From tranquil cornfields to bustling city streets, Indiana holds untold stories of crime and mystery. Join us as we navigate through the pages of the Hoosier Case File and bring you the stories that have long lingered in the shadows of the Hoosier State.
In each episode, we'll take you on a journey through the cases that continue to puzzle even the most seasoned investigators.
We will discuss the evidence, look at the leads, and invite you along as we speculate on possibilities surrounding these cases.
We will also shine the light on the solved crimes where justice prevailed and the pieces of the puzzle finally came together.
So true crime fans, come along with us as we pursue truth, both in the unsolved and the triumphs of justice.
Grab your cup of coffee as we navigate through the twists and turns of the Hoosier Case File.
Let the investigations begin.
Listeners, the case we're going to be discussing today happened in our hometown of Hammond, Indiana. David Edward Maust was a serial killer who murdered 3 Hammond boys and buried them in his basement. His crimes shocked the nation upon his arrest in December of 2003.
This happened just a few blocks from where we grew up, and we would often see David Maust either riding his bike or walking by our parents' house all the time. We always thought he looked creepy, but we never could really explain why he gave that vibe.
Our parents would even refer to him as the Man in Black because he would walk right around with his black coat on.
Yeah, and that by itself is very odd. I mean, we're talking a 90-degree or a hotter day, and you have this guy on this bike or walking around with his black coat and black clothing.
Our dad ended up working as a reserve police officer for the city of Hammond and said it was the most horrible thing he had ever witnessed.
Yes, Dad said he didn't sleep for days after this case broke.
So let's go ahead and get into it.
In May of 2003, 19-year-old Nick James disappeared from his parents' Hammond home. He would not be officially reported as missing until months later.
The reason he was not reported missing right away was because it was thought he had run away.
Now, Nick James knew David Maust because they had worked together at a shop called Trophies R Us over in Dolton, Illinois.
Sadly, in September of 2003, 2 other teenage boys went missing from their Hammond homes.
13-year-old Michael Dennis Jr. and 16-year-old James Rainey were reported missing.
The crazy thing is that both Michael and James left notes for their parents saying they were running away from home.
Now, these notes seem suspicious to their parents.
Yeah, the boys' parents did not believe that they would just go missing like that.
The parents reported that their sons had befriended a man who the neighborhood referred to as Crazy Dave, and the boys liked to play video games with him.
Detective Lieutenant Ron Johnson began investigating this case. He wanted to find out just who this Crazy Dave was. Johnson grew concerned after a check on Maust revealed that he had a very violent history.
The report they ran showed that Maust had been convicted in not 1, but 2 deaths of young boys in the past. They brought Maust in for questioning, and he, of course, denied knowing where the boys went. He did, however, tell the police that he had given the boys some money to run away.
This is the point where Maust became the main suspect in the case. Police did not know whether Maust had killed these boys, if he had only helped them in running away from home.
Either way, they knew that he was involved somehow.
On December 5th, 2003, Hammond police were able to get a search warrant of David Maust's apartment at 4933 Ash Avenue in North Hammond.
Now, according to a November 3rd, 2019 Northwest Indiana Times article titled A Serial Killer in Hammond, written by Sarah Reese, investigators went to Maust's rental home and found him in the backyard, quote, sitting on a railroad tie, smoking a cigarette, and drinking a beer.
In that same Northwest Indiana Times article, retired Hammond Police Detective Lieutenant Ron Johnson described Maust's attitude when they went out to investigate him as he was not nervous at all. He was very cordial and friendly. And this behavior is what caused Detective Johnson to become immediately suspicious of Maust.
So the search warrant for the apartment itself turned up nothing with no sign of these boys.
However, other tenants and the owner of the house allowed Detective Johnson into the basement.
And this is where the pieces of this puzzle started to come together.
In the basement, Detective Johnson sees what he describes in the November 9th Times article as a buildup of cement in the southwest corner of the basement.
Now, listeners, I have to admit, growing up in Hammond, this would not seem strange at first glance because the basements flood a lot of the times. And in Hammond, a lot of people have their washers and dryers up on blocks. I know our parents had them up on bricks, or they'll build up a little area of the basement with cement, and this is to keep them up off the floor and keep them dry.
However, Detective Johnson realized that this could not be the case. In the November 9th Times article, he states that the water hookup was not even close to the area where the cement was.
Detective Johnson states in the article, quote, the thing that struck me funny, it was about 15 feet away from the water hookup. So it was all by itself over in the corner. It didn't look right. But at the time, we didn't know anything different.
A cadaver dog was very interested in this strange cement, and that is when police drilled a hole into the cement to see if anything was there.
Now, listeners, when they drilled the hole, coffin flies came out of the hole.
Coffin flies are an insect that are known to be attracted to decay, or as Google search put it, rotting organic matter.
Now, with this new information, the area of the basement was then excavated, and sadly, on December 9th, 2003, Hammond police found the bodies of Michael Dennis Jr. and James Rainey in the concrete of this basement.
Now, while this was going on, David Maust was arrested while riding his bike back home from the Dalton, Illinois trophy shop where he worked.
And sadly, the next day, Nick James' body was also found under a concrete slab near where Michael and James' bodies were discovered.
We will be back after a short break to discuss David Maust's violent history.
It's truly unreal that this man was ever let out to walk the streets.
Stay tuned. So on December 11th, 2003, David Maust was officially charged by the state of Indiana for the murders of Michael Dennis Jr., James Rainey, and Nick James.
He fully cooperated with the police investigation. He admitted to murdering the boys. He even admitted that he had talked the boys into writing letters to their parents under the guise of helping them run away.
The details of the murders, once they were revealed, are disturbing.
Maust cooperated with Hammond police and admitted that he had stabbed the boys multiple times, that he had tied them up in the basement of his apartment building, that he had beat them, and also he had strangled each of the boys.
He then covered their bodies up with concrete. Apparently, when Maust moved to Hammond in 2002, he had moved hundreds of pounds of concrete with him.
Now, see, Mary, that is disturbing as well. Why didn't anybody think this was suspicious? What renter needs to have that much concrete?
I agree that it looks fishy. Maust also told detectives working the case that he used to hang out wherever kids were playing.
So this makes sense. Why we always saw him walking down Columbia, because he was near Columbia Park.
Creepy to think about that, though.
He also told Detective Johnson that he would use things like giving the kids money, playing video games, letting the kids try alcohol and drugs in order to gain their trust and to get them to be his friend.
Of course, once these kids were comfortable with Maust, they were the most in danger.
Now, Maust pleaded guilty to the charges, and in November of 2005, he was sentenced with 3 life sentences to run consecutively, and the judge even said that he would never have the chance of parole.
In January of 2006, Maust unalived himself in his Lake County jail cell. He left a 7-page unaliving note, which he expressed remorse for the murders. I will never forget this because one of the officers called our dad late at night, and I will never forget what he said.
I will not forget this either because although I had moved downstate at this time, I was actually home visiting my mom and dad and staying at the house when this happened. So I can remember dad waking up the whole house just yelling loudly, "Yes, there is a God."
Yes, one of his friends on the department called to let him know that Maust had unalived himself.
Now, according to a true crime blog and podcast article from October 11, 2023, the note read, "Life in prison is not what the parents wanted, and the Indiana taxpayer does not want to pay the bill. The families wanted me to receive the death sentence, and so do families and parents across America. Dying is not my first choice, but it's the right thing to do."
If there is anything good to come out of this, it's that Indiana now has passed legislation as of 2007 that someone convicted of a murder and is out of jail has to register as a violent offender.
Yes. Now, Indiana had already had a sex offender registry, and that legislation was passed back in 1994. And that law was known as Zachary's Law. And according to the Vigo County Sheriff's Department, this law is in honor of 10-year-old Zachary Snyder, Cloverdale, Indiana boy who was molested and murdered by a neighbor who had previously been convicted of child molesting. So under Zachary's Law, convicted sex offenders are required to register with the local law enforcement authority of their county of residence.
Zachary's Law was replaced in 2006 by Indiana Statute IC 11-8-8. This statute now details the duties and responsibilities of law enforcement agencies across the state, as well as the responsibilities of the convicted offender.
So according to the new statute, Indiana says there's 5 types of offenders, and these are sexually violent predators, offenders against children, serious sex offenders, and violent offenders.
There are 2 types of registration, 10 years and lifetime.
Now, July 1st, 2007, Indiana passed Stephanie's Law, and this legislation requires anyone on parole for a violent offense to register the same way a sex offender has to.
The bill is named in honor of Stephanie Wagner, a 16-year-old Indiana girl who was murdered in Cass County in 2006. Stephanie's killer was a convicted murderer who was on parole from Kansas.
Now, Stephanie Wagner's family has made it a mission to have other states enact this legislation.
So far, Illinois has Stephanie's Law.
And I think the registries are a good thing. It definitely gives parents an option of trying to make sure their children are around people who are safe.
One of the biggest questions out there whenever it comes to serial killers, and one that a true crime blog and podcast article from October 11, 2023 asks is, quote, "Are some of people just born evil, or do bad parents create monsters?"
And that's a very good question. It's one that I think a lot of us wonder about.
If you go through the David Maust's timeline, it becomes pretty apparent that he was messed up from a young age.
Now let's wrap this up with the timeline of events and discuss a few key points in Maust's life that may have led him to where he ended up.
We're going to use the timeline that Sarah Reese wrote in her November 3rd, 2019 Northwest Indiana Times article titled "A Serial Killer in Hammond." So here we go. He was born in 1954 in Pennsylvania, and his family moved to Chicago in 1961.
In October of 1962, when Maust was 8 years old, the first big life-changing event happened when his parents separate. In fact, the following year, when he was 9 years old, he was admitted to the Chicago State Hospital. He was there till 1967 when he's moved to the Ulrich Children's Home in Chicago, which had a reputation at the time for sexual abuse.
There are different reports on why, but it is basically said that his mother had him committed.
Yeah, everything I've read on this case, it's repeatedly stated that his mother just did not want him, that she thought he was evil.
In 1970, he escaped from the Chicago State Hospital in April. What's really wild to me is that the hospital never reported him as missing.
What?
Yep, they had him marked down as discharged.
In 1971 and 72, he stayed with family down in Georgia. Eventually, he made his way back to Chicago. His mother did not want him home. So in 1972, he enlisted in the Army, and he enlisted and was transferred to Germany that same year.
1974 is when Maust commits his first murder. 13-year-old James McClister was tied to a tree and beaten to death in 1974 while Maust was stationed in Frankfurt, Germany with the U.S. Army.
Yeah, as stated in the article, quote, at court-martial, Maust is convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 4 years at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas.
After he serves his sentence in Kansas, he is released and goes back to Chicago. He was not out long when, in September of 1979, Maust allegedly stabbed a coworker at his apartment on the north side of Chicago. Somehow he was acquitted of armed violence, attempted murder, and aggravated battery in April 1980.
Now, according to this Times article, in August of 1981, 15-year-old Donald Jones of Chicago was stabbed and drowned in an Elgin quarry. His body was not found until October 7th, 1981.
Yeah, it starts to get wild here. In December 1981, Maust was arrested for stabbing a teenager in Galveston, Texas. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 5 years in prison there.
Now, Illinois had him extradited back to Cook County in 1983, and he faced charges for the murder of Donald Jones. Now, get this. He's found unfit for trial and was again put into some type of a mental facility until 1987, when a judge decided he was now fit to stand trial.
He goes to trial and pleads guilty. In 1994, he was sentenced to 35 years for Jones' murder. 35 years.
Unbelievably, he's paroled in 1999 for time served.
In 2002, he was working in Dolton, Illinois at Trophies R Us, and the owner of the shop offered him to rent an apartment in a building he owns in Hammond, Indiana.
Now, Maust made the move to Hammond in 2002 after he was paroled from the state of Illinois.
He moved to Hammond, bringing all of this cement with him.
Now, I've read in several different articles, it was a crazy amount of cement, too. One source said it was something like 80 bags of concrete.
I still say that looks suspicious.
I agree. Who rents and needs that much concrete?
Agreed. From there, we know the rest of the story, sadly. He murdered Nick James in May of 2003 and James Rainey and Michael Dennis in September of that same year.
Now, all of the bodies were found in December of 2003. Maust is formally charged, pleads guilty in October of 2005, and by January of 2006, he was unalived.
It is a really disturbing case for sure. He was given so many chances to do better and just could not. He pleaded several times to not be let out because he knew he would hurt someone.
It's really frustrating.
There is always that debate on whether or not someone like this is born that way or made to be this way.
Everything I have ever read about Maust's mother, Eva Reyes, was that she did not want him. And I think a mother's rejection is a pretty powerful thing.
I've read at one point that she kept hoping he would run away, but he never did. And that's why she had him put into the mental hospital when he was 9.
The Hammond police talked to Eva Reyes, and she repeatedly told Detective Johnson that Maust was, quote, a bad seed.
In the November 3rd, 2019 Times article, Detective Johnson says that Reyes told him that Maust had tried to drown his younger brother and also tried to set the crib on fire.
Now, Maust denied all of this to Detective Johnson.
I have to admit that from everything we've uncovered, he was pretty honest about everything.
I agree. It also seems like Eva Reyes was mentally ill herself. She had been in and out of facilities. She did not want to admit to mistreating David.
Yeah, and the Times article mentions that she said something creepy to Detective Johnson. She asked the officer if he would be her son after David's death.
See, that's just not right. And that's not just something that a person would say.
I just don't understand why he was let out on the streets after multiple examples of him not being able to handle it. All of the abuse and mistreatment he suffered was terrible too. It in no way gives any excuses for why he was the way that he was.
No, I don't think it gives any kind of excuses, but I do think talking about cases like this are important. And the reason why it's important is that it may help prevent some of these things from happening. And I think if Maust was monitored closer, or if those registry, the violent offender registry existed back in 2003, maybe none of this would have happened.
What do you think about this case? Is there a detail we missed? Did you know any of the victims? We would love to hear from you. Please send us an email to HoosierCasefile@gmail.com or reach out to us on social media. We may use it in a later episode. In the email, let us know if you wish to remain anonymous.
To see our source material, please visit our website, www.hoosiercasefile.com. Please find us and follow us on Facebook or on Instagram. Hoosier Case File is a Quigley Productions podcast.
Our theme song was written and recorded by Earl G. Wilhelm.
Stay safe, everyone.